Welcome, kia ora koutou. Hello, thank you for those of you who have come. Welcome, kia ora koutou. Hello, thank you for those of you who have come. It's awesome to actually see some people in the audience. Really appreciate that. My name is Dave Sanderson. I'm the project leader for collection imaging at Auckland War Memorial Museum in New Zealand. Real quick sort of breakdown about how we're going to run through this. I'm going to give you a bit of a quick overview about Auckland, New Zealand, the Pacific, where we are. And then I'm going to get into this sort of context, the strategic context about how the museum's got to the point where it's doing a collection imaging project in the first place. We're going to get a bit geeky, so there's some technical stuff, not too much, so you don't all have to run out of the room. And then we're also going to go into a little bit about how we're starting to implement that into dams and digital collections and digital preservation as well, before kind of giving you a little sneak peek about how we're using the material that we've been photographing recently. If you want to tune in on your laptops while you go through the talk, aucklandmuseum.com/collections is our collections online website, so you can kind of tune into some of the stuff. If you see a really naff picture, we didn't take it. If you see something really awesome, I'm claiming it, whether it was us or not, okay? And if you want to sort of hit me on Twitter now or later, feel free. They're the contact details up there. So, hands up, those of you in the audience who have actually been to New Zealand. Awesome, you rock. You can come again. The rest of you need to come on holiday because it's awesome. Okay. So said map here is to show you, roughly speaking, where we are. The top of the North Island there is the bit in black, and to put it into perspective, you've got the Pacific Islands. It's a rough green box. It's not particularly accurate. But that's basically the Pacific there, and then to orientate you, Australia with Sydney. Okay. So New Zealand as a country runs completely north to south. The top of it is up above Australia and is in subtropics, and then the southern part is like very, very cold. Okay? So New Zealand itself is about the same sort of land mass as the UK, but 4.7 million people. It's about 3.5 million in the North Island, 1.2-ish in the lower South Island. The little blob on the bottom is actually a third island, but nobody ever talks about it because it's too cold to go there. So I guess in relation to what you might have seen on TV, that means all the Lord of the Rings stuff, that's down south where there are no people. And if you want to see the rolling hills and see where all the people live and the beaches and all that kind of stuff, think North Island. That's a brief synopsis, okay? The capital is Wellington, which is about 400,000 people. That's at the bottom end of the North Island. So Auckland, where we are, as you can see, is a healthy chunk of the national population, about 1.6 million people there. And to kind of put this into context a little bit, for those of you who don't know, the indigenous population in New Zealand are Maori, and that represents, I think, the last time I looked, it was around about 30% of the population identify with being Maori, or of Maori descent. But actually, we're approaching close, now 10% of Auckland's population is Pacific. And what that really means is it's arguable that Auckland's the biggest Pacific city on Earth. There are more people in Auckland from the Pacific region than there are in the Pacific themselves. So that's us. That's Auckland itself looking pretty. It's quite nice on the harbour. The museum where I work at is fortunate enough to be up on the hill overlooking all this. It's got a great big panoramic view across the Auckland harbour and out to our nearest volcano, Rangitoto, which is not dormant. And the museum itself sometimes gets misconstrued by being War Memorial Museum, that we just deal with war, which is not true. We have three main collection areas: human history, which actually encompasses history, war, archaeology, Maori, world and Pacific ethnology, and applied arts. So there's some really cool like garments, clothing, design, that kind of stuff in there. We've got natural science collections as well, which span from like big, huge sharks down to tiny, tiny, tiny little insects and everything in between. We've also got documentary heritage collection, where there is a healthy library, which is very, very heavily used as a reference library. But for instance, in there we've also got a lot of manuscripts and archives, and about 800,000 negatives and slides, as well as some paintings. So it's the building itself that's the War Memorial, okay? When it was built, I guess the front part of the building, as you see it, is actually constructed as a war memorial. And that means that we serve this function of being a place of commemoration, both inside the building and out. This is a direct copy of the cenotaph that you'd see in London, and we have it outside the front of the museum. We regularly do commemorative events there. This is Anzac Day, which is the Australian and New Zealand soldiers that served. And we observe this each year on the day that they took their heaviest losses at Gallipoli in Turkey during World War I. So the museum's got a lot of stuff going on. And the Collection Imaging Project came on board to try and make a big dent, basically, in the imaging for all of this stuff. So some context. Future Museum is a document that was delivered in 2012. It went over the line as we got our new director, who was past, formerly he was at the British Maritime Museum, where he did a lot of good transformative stuff down there. The guy's name's Roy Clare. He's leaving us at Christmas, having made a massive difference in the 6 years he's been with us. One of his biggest things has been the delivery of this strategy. And I guess the cool thing about that, and I'm not a strategy fan, I hate paperwork, I really do. I don't like reading this stuff. But when you read this, it's probably the best strategy document I've ever seen. It's really digestible. Every single staff member in the whole place and every volunteer knows what it is and what they do in relation to supporting it. So it's a pretty cool place to work when everybody in the whole building knows how they're aiming to one goal. We're 4 years into that now, for those of you who can do the maths. So we're well underway with what we're trying to deliver. I guess the big sort of take-home things are, in relation to the way other museums work, is we're redoing every gallery in the building inside this time frame without closing. We're trying to turn our focus to being on-site, off-site and online, so everything that we do will be delivered in all three of those areas. And we're ably supported by these two supporting strategies, Hei Karari Maori and Tualawa, which are kind of Pacific and Maori dimensions, bringing in the way that we work with those cultures into everything we do at the museum. But I guess for the photography part, the collection imaging part, the geeky bit is this statement on page 4, I might add, if you wanted to look at it, about how we become a digital museum. And that really lines up into all those guys with computers and like networks and servers and cameras and all that kind of stuff. The three things that lay listed on there are not the complete list, but we talk about digital guardianship, sustainable delivery, and universal access. So you can probably start to see roughly where we're going, which is down this angle of trying to deliver everything we've got, or as much of it's possible, out there. We're supported with this, the content and engagement strategy, another strategy. Again, it's quite easy to read and not too scary. And in it, we basically take the stance that the museum, everything it does will be collections-led in its approach. So that now then means that collections are going to be the feature of on-site, off-site and online. And we launched last year Collections Online, the website I pointed out at the start of the talk, using linked open data. So we're another kind of open GLAM advocate in that sense. We are using the content as well in the way that we develop the galleries. And you get a sneak peek of a gallery that doesn't actually open publicly until a couple of days from now, coming up later on. And all that open by default stuff is done through Creative Commons licensing wherever possible. Again, we're going to touch on that a little bit more later on. So a big question we get asked quite a lot is how you're paying for it. So I sat in a room with our finance dude a couple of weeks ago and was like, hi, Samit, I've got to go to New Orleans and tell the people over there, how are we paying for this? Explain the world of finance to me. Anyway, Dave, just tell them we've been saving. And because he went into it in some great depth and detail, and ultimately, once I'd had my head broken, what he basically meant is, yes, we've been saving. So the museum, as I suppose a lot of museums has had this kind of knowledge and vision that it's going to be doing some transformation work for a long time. So the bottom line, they've taken slices out of that for like the last 10 years and been sticking it away, investing it, kind of doing good things with money. And now we're drawing down on that cash. That's it, basically, in a nutshell. So we're not kind of, really bringing in massive amounts of external sponsorship. The funding mechanism in New Zealand is quite different to what I see here. We're largely sort of funded from the local council, which I guess is like state government versus federal government. So a large portion of our income comes from taxpayers of Auckland. And I guess that means then that the communities that we're serving have also already paid for all of this stuff as well. But to give you some examples, some of the other capital projects we're drawing down on, we've got the building work that's been done, all the galleries are being ripped out, we're all drawing down on this sort of cash. And to give you a rough sense, we've got about 100-ish permanent employees, but it's at about 350 at the moment. The rest of those are all on contract in various funding roles related to drawing down on these capital projects. We've got about another 300 volunteers working with us. And just as a scope, I suppose, for the museum as a whole, it's about 3.5 million objects in the collection. So this is the first one that came off the ranks. This is a project called TRWay. This started just about 3 years ago. It's coming up to finishing. And in it, we did all of the things for collections readiness, right? We tried to do everything. So we did some conservation work, some repackaging, rehousing, cataloguing work, and we did the guys in the team there did all the photography as well. So these were collection technicians that did a bit of everything. To summarise, and it is really summarising, there's a lot more to it than this, but the collection that this worked on is the Maori carvings. And they obviously have some quite significant meaning to, I guess, all New Zealanders actually, not just Maori. But possibly like the easiest way to relate that is thinking in terms of like totem poles, for instance, that kind of stuff. They represent ancestors and that kind of thing. It taught us a lot, okay? And taught us a lot about what we don't do and what we do need to do. And this is kind of really what set the scene for our Collections Readiness project now. And the man with squeaky wheels out the back. It's also pretty useful to point out that this gallery, this workspace was converted from a gallery as well, and it was all open access, glass-sided, so people could see all the staff working all the way through this. We've not done that from this point onwards. We have little windows people can peer in, but they don't get to like be in a goldfish bowl. So the collections hub, this is the bit where we start talking about how we closed public galleries to make way for this. This is the Coast Gallery as was, and my boss at the time this was happening last year was the head of natural sciences. And he didn't really like this gallery that much. It was a bit old and stale, so he wasn't that, upset about losing it. But this basically tells the story of coastal New Zealand. Next door, there was the Oceans Gallery. And those big sharks that you see there, some of them have gone into storage. One now lives behind my head about 6 feet away, and all I hear all day is kids shouting, "Oh, shark, shark!" It's both very, very endearing and quite frustrating, but we've grown to love the great white. So those spaces that you see there, this is July 2015. We had quite a long lead time. We've been able to close those down, a lot longer than we wanted to because of all the public programs that were booked for these galleries. We have anywhere up to about 20 coach loads of tourists come in from cruise ships regularly on days, and they book these tours months in advance. We also have educational classes for school kids and that kind of stuff. And we basically had to sit all those out until we were in a position to close the gallery down. Those spaces now look like this. This is the staff side of the collections hub. This is home to between about 15 and 25 staff working specifically on just doing collections readiness. It's pretty cool, but also a little bit echoey because it did used to be a gallery, right? And then we built this from where the sharks used to live. This is the imaging studio that the Collection Imaging Project work out of. I'm going to go into a bit more detail about that and talk about some of the toys and how we've set it up shortly. But overall, I guess we get into this stage now where you might be sat in the audience going, "Fantastic, Dave, excellent. You've kind of kicked all the public out the galleries, sent them kicking and screaming, and you've made your little empire, your space now. I mean, what are you going to do with it?" It's a big question. I'll be honest with you, when the keys got handed over to this space, I was quite worried about what we were going to do with it. There's a bit of pressure on us, So that collections hub's home to 4 projects at the moment. One of them just coming to an end. I manage 2 World War I collection technicians who've been working on World War I collections specifically to deliver the first 2 galleries we're opening, and I'm going to show you the first one of those very shortly. We're also doing collections cataloguing, so we've got a team of 12 staff working 4 people in each of those 3 collection areas, and all they're doing is cataloguing the collections to try and get that data into the databases. The Pacific Collection Access Project, which I'm going to give a little extra shout out because we're particularly proud of this. This is a project where the museum is not just doing sort of repackaging, rehousing, conservation, but the cataloguing part of it is being done completely in tandem with the communities from the 13 Pacific Islands that we're working with. So we're approaching about 5,500 collection objects, but each one of those are being catalogued both in English and the native language of each Pacific Island, and we're bringing those community groups into the space to like share that role of knowledge holder, as opposed to us being the almighty museum that knows everything, And then collection imaging, and we get to take the photos for all of this and some more stuff. So it's a unique space. This is the Pacific Collection Access Project launch. We quite regularly get interrupted with tour groups of Pacific people coming in, and it's quite special really to be working on collections when you actually get to see people who haven't seen this stuff. This is our ancestors' stuff from 200 years ago, and be in the room with them while they're singing and sort of praying, and it's a wonderful place to work. They do get a bit touchy-feely at times, I've got to say. So the museum hat kind of gets a little bit panicky while they get their hands in there, but it's a wonderful place to work. Example of some of the images that we've been shooting in the Pacific stuff. This is a Cook Island fan. I believe this is about 100 years old. And we've got a real focus on trying to photograph the construction techniques so that the lost arts about how these are made can be taken back to the Pacific Islands and rejuvenate the arts and craft. Ceremonial adzes. You've got to remember these things are made long before what we would know now as like a normal carving tool. It's basically stone and wood and nothing else to do this. So with any project, you've got to set a scope, right? Otherwise, it just blows out into smithereens and you never get anything done. So when we started this, we had this kind of conversation about what we're not going to do. So brief summary of that. All the marketing and events images. Our photographers don't have to worry about sort of working until 12 at night photographing an opening of a gallery or something like that, right? It's pretty cool. For me, that was a really big win because I've been there, done that, and it really does distract quite a lot from collection imaging. The conservation staff, as they're doing their treatment work, they take their own images. The business as usual collection photography work, so our collection managers, when they're out and about in the stores working there with their collections, they're shooting their own stuff too. So if something's been accessioned into the collection, for instance, those images as it comes in, they're shooting that, we're not doing it. The online content, as with all good museums these days, we've got a team doing like digital stuff on the internet through all the millions of channels that we've got going. Actually, it's driven by a digital content team, but they are particularly good at managing to steal photos from pretty much anybody who can make one from anywhere. So our stuff does regularly end up in this, but we don't shoot specifically for it. And then the pictorial and documentary collections, we do work with, it's largely two external contractors, external partners for doing digitisation. But those cataloguing guys I mentioned earlier on, they're actually scanning their negs while they're cataloguing. So in that regard, they're doing imaging as well, but that's the only aspect of any of that cataloguing project that does any kind of imaging. So that's cool. We've palmed that stuff off to one side nicely. You go, excellent, that's great. So what do we actually do? So I guess the first little segue is one of the first things that we delivered on as the project came to be was to come over here. We did a bit of research on the BKA Plus imaging system. I don't know if any of you guys use these or not. They're made by what I would politely sort of say is a mad scientist in a shed in Virginia. He's awesome. He's a really, really good engineer, but he is a one-man band literally building these things in his garage, basically. This took over for us. We're doing type specimen imaging, and we've been at this for a long time, way before this project started. But we hit a point where we couldn't photograph the really, really small stuff. So this stuff has come in and picked that up. And it's also managed to turf out our Leica system, which had like a sensor and microscope technology to it. Way too proprietary and non-upgradable, basically. And all this is all modular. So I can pretty much replace anything on that myself and keep it running. It's got the 5DS stuff on it, so a 50 megapixel camera photographing things, and anywhere up to 50 times life-size imaging we're doing with this. So these images actually came on week 1 of the testing. These are relatively large insects that we've photographed. Because you can see examples, same specimen, 5, 10, 20, and 50 times life-size stuff. This is probably one of the more technically challenging images the guys took. The little line there, if you can't read it, is 0.5 millimeter. So the torso of that is 1 millimeter long, basically. That's 1,500 images shot and all stacked and merged together. And that's not like new technology to museum people, but the fact we're doing it with completely modular gear, which is non-proprietary, and getting results like that out of it is we're quite happy with. So the collection imaging project has responsibility for the oversight of this work, even though it has been going on for a while. And then the other stuff, this is the bit that we actually do, this is our bread and butter work, and you can neatly summarize it into like these two main blocks, basically. So within that collection hub, and we think about collection readiness as a complete picture, the Pacific Collection Access Project and the Collection Cataloguing Project, they bring the collection out, do their bit, be it cataloguing, conservation, rehousing, that kind of stuff, it comes through the studio and we will photograph 100% of everything that they're working on. From an imaging standpoint, that's not that efficient actually, because they tend to work on quite small batches of stuff. But as the overall hub works, as an end-to-end journey for the collections, it's actually quite efficient for that. So there's a friction there in how the big picture works versus just the responsibility of the imaging. But we're also fortunate enough, actually, it's about 3 or 4 weeks from now, we'll be adding an extra photographer to the team working specifically on large artworks. That's cool. They've got their own body of work, which shall not be interrupted by anything else. So we can just kind of plough through that. And then what we refer to as being the collections backlog, which is in essence anything that's not business as usual, is catalogued but doesn't have a photo. And that's a lot of stuff. We're talking millions of stuff, millions of items. So that's, I guess, like our efficient stuff that we work through. So I'm going to get a little bit nerdy. If any of you fall asleep, I won't say anything. Hopefully it's not too over the top. So when I started the project, having worked at several other institutions in the sector, I kind of came up with this concept, and nobody challenged it, which is quite cool. Nobody ever really asked me to kind of like be accountable for this. It's just a bright idea. But we came up with the idea of the 90% rule, right? So if you can picture on one extreme, you've got that really, really bad collection imaging. And we've all seen it because every museum's got it, right? That stuff where somebody's holding it in a blue glove and the background is like part white and part Jim from the next department, and the colour accuracy is all over the place. Or somebody's just popped it down on the table and you can see the edge of the table and everything else around it. That really bad kind of nasty collection imaging that nobody really wants to own up to. If that's one extreme, and the other extreme is that kind of fancy pants art photography that you would see in like an art house auction catalogue or something like that. What I theorise that we can do 90% of that, but quickly, based purely on the fact that you hire the right people and you give them the right tools, and you kind of take the roadblocks out of the system. So that's what we went for. I guess feeding into that is how we staffed it. We specifically went out and looked for nobody who'd ever worked in the museum or GLAM sector before. We figured out that we could train somebody to how to handle things safely easier than you could try and train a heritage photographer who's worked in the industry for 20 years how to be quick. A bit of a sweeping statement, sorry. And again, I've been there and I've actually seen all this stuff myself in many different institutions. So I guess the giggles are because you kind of partially identify, right? Good, thanks. So they're all commercial photographers with a studio background, wherever we can get that. The actual, while I came away last week, we're just finishing off a latest round of recruitment for these positions. And we were actually trying to add an element of non-commercial photography into it and get somebody with sector experience to complete that puzzle. That didn't actually pan out, so we are still following this rule. We had 3 photographers from the outset. We're about 11 months into the project now, and it's probably worth pointing out that's more like 2.5. A few months ago, one of the guys left. He's taken up a nice teaching position doing photography, and of the remaining 2, one of them is actually on a slightly shorter hours per week. So it's around about 2.5 FTEs we've had so far. And of course, as with all photographers worldwide, especially in New Zealand, because the advertising industry there is not big enough to bring most of it onshore, we consume advertising from overseas largely. All photographers, when they're working commercially, are fighting for every last job they get, right? They're all out there in the marketplace, and every time somebody posts a $200 job up online, 3,000 of them scramble over it and say, I'll do it for 190, or I'll do it for 180. And it's like, I guess the way of making money as a commercial photographer is kind of dying out. But what that brings with it is people who've got quite a lot of experience now where time is money, and they're quite ruthless about getting through the job nice and quickly. And then we add a lovely, lovely lady, Sarah Powell, who sits like quite literally next to me on where I sit, who's our rights specialist. And we're fortunate to be able to kind of embed that specifically as part of the collection imaging team. And she is very much of the museum background. We wanted somebody who really knew the nuts and bolts about how museums work and rights treatment. And it's her job is to apply the rights licensing for every image that we shoot, but she's also working programmatically through the rest of the collections as well. Big job. And if any of you are kind of like rights related, you've got mates who are like rights gods or anything, Sarah, honestly, she really, really wanted to be here and she would love to be put in touch with any of them. So the studio itself, the way that we built this, it had to be completely scalable, right? The smallest stuff we've got is like a couple of millimeters long. The largest stuff we've got is 30, 40 meters, right? We've got everything from World War II fighter planes through to canoes to stuffed elks and field guns and clothing. It's just anything you can possibly think about. And on my interview day, the guys are taking me around, and once they'd kind of been and shown me all this, they went, "Are you scared?" And because I said no, I think I got the job. I think that was it. But we had to build the studio specifically to be able to cater to all this. So the studio is home to 5 people working in there. It's designed to accommodate up to 5, but it's also designed to be completely scalable. So we can actually bolt together all of the 5 setups to make one if we need to and switch it around. And I guess the one thing that I really wanted to do, which is something you don't necessarily see in a lot of GLAM institutions, is give them the tools for the job. You know, it's quite common to kind of go into studios and a lot of places and they're kind of struggling a little bit with some bodging things together sometimes. I wanted to make sure that the store cupboard for this had every tool that they would need, and it's paying off. So we researched this. I was fortunate enough to come over here about 18 months ago and spend a week with the Smithsonian DPO, Digitisation Program Office, and particularly Ken Raheim taught me quite a lot about how they've set up their projects. I'm kind of in envy of their like many thousands of dollars conveyor belt systems, right, that they sort of wheel in and wheel out. I think one of those systems costs more than we spent on the entire studio and that macro imaging system. So A, we can't afford it, and B, it's not flexible like we needed it to. And I guess the thing that kind of came home with me from the States last time was to kind of understand that in their case, it's capture that they're focusing on, and all the other work before and afterwards is happening like outside of the scope of that project. Whereas for us, a lot of that is being done all at once as one end-to-end process. So I've worked in a few of the different studios and imaging departments in New Zealand. I went around a few of the others, had a nosy at what they were doing. But it was actually commercial rental studios that gave us the biggest tips. There's a really big studio in Auckland that has it does everything from photographing clothing and food through to I've seen the front of a jet airplane in there for like a 747 size thing for advertising for an airline. And their flexibility and expandability was what guided how we bought the equipment we did. I also used to run a scanning factory at Archives New Zealand, where we had 35 students running 6 at a time, 24/7, scanning longhand, 1 image at a time, all of the World War I personnel files. And I guess the way that we funneled all that data, which is like 4.5 million images that we did, educated us on how to draw the data lines and the data paths that we use in the studio in Auckland. But the really cool thing was I went and had a chat with some guys who'd set up a studio for a department store, and I guess Walmart might be like the nearest to what I'm thinking here. For many years they've consumed commercial photographers, but of course, as with everything, declining budgets, costs trying to hang on, and they basically figured out that they could can that and bring it all in-house. So one of them in particular has built 9 studios, one of which is a TV studio, and they create all of their imaging for flyers, marketing, TV adverts and everything in-house now. And almost all of the same equipment ended up in our museum. So we bought good stuff. We didn't buy the best that there is. I get asked quite a lot why we didn't buy medium format digital cameras. And the honest answer is they cost quite a bit of money, and I've never worked in a commercial a GLAM sector studio where they've worked reliably inside a corporate IT network. We have to subscribe to the kind of Windows roaming profile login and out system, even though we save data locally to the machines. I haven't managed to get any of the medium format cameras to work reliably and not hang within that environment at 4 institutions I've worked at. So for any of you who've got tips and tricks on that, I'm all ears. We bought Broncolor stuff for the lighting just because it's reliable, right? It's good quality gear. We didn't buy the flash packs and flash heads because it's like 4 times the cost, basically. We shoot everything tethered. Probably nothing new to you, but when I first arrived at the museum, it was quite common to see staff going around and they'd sort of take their camera down, they'd hand hold it, wheel the lights in and out, never change their exposure, take a few photos, go back, download it on their memory card, realise that they'd stuffed it up or they'd not switched manual focus on, and go back and shoot it all again. And I'm like, well, this is madness, right? If we can actually create a system where you can see everything up front, live, then you know if you've made a mistake straight away. And we try to lock and standardize everything down as much as possible because it removes the variance, right? But this, I'm assuming this is like not rocket science to you guys as an audience. So this is how we designed it. In my kind of utopian view of the world, we would shoot with a camera operated via the laptop. The data would never hit the laptop in the first place. It's just a tool to operate it. The data would pass through using a mapped drive, and we had a special network put in for this specifically, onto a solid-state disk in the photographer's processing PCs next door. That solid-state disk would be your watch folder for Lightroom, and therefore, as you click go, you're basically like 60% of the way through its journey at the point of capture. This really pleased my kind of OCD and minimalism. Doesn't work. So we do capture things and name it and get the exposure and the white balance and all that kind of stuff up front at the time you hit enter on the keyboard. So there's no alteration of that later on. What we have found, and you'll see this from the next slide, is after trying lots of different tethering software, our preferred option, and it's not unique in this, but our preferred option basically can't handle image previews even across its own dedicated network link that's traveling like 8 meters. And it holds us up. So when you're shooting, you can't actually reliably tell what you've just captured without waiting. So what we're actually doing at the moment is getting things stored locally to the laptop, transferred out at the end of the day for export. This really upsets me. So again, if anybody's got tips on this, on how to fix it, come and see me, because I'll be your best friend forever. So the tethering software we tried heaps actually, but these are the main 4 we gave a go. We went through the EOS utility, which, surprise, surprise, for the Canon cameras actually works. It should do, really, shouldn't it? But it does work really well. But the naming menu from when you alter and sort of name your files is too deep within the application, basically, to be quick and reliable. Capture One is our bugbear in terms of this reliable capturing software within the IT environment. And again, we love it when it works. But on the PCs that we've got running this, where we have to run it, it's a common thing to get 20 or 30 hangs or reboots a day with a camera, completely crashing. So we scrapped that and we didn't use that. We used Lightroom as well. That actually didn't work straight out of the box, and we had to hack some of the program files to get it to work with the Canon cameras. But again, naming's too deep in the menus. So we actually went with the Breeze system, the DSLR Remote Pro, which is a painfully simple program because it actually doesn't do very much. What it does do, it does really, really well, but don't ask it to do very much at all. It's got a few nice little touches in it that you can have several cameras connected to it, and it's shall I say, simple enough? I was going to say dumb, but that's a bit rude. But simple enough that it just recognises the files as they're being written. So you can use 2, 3, 4 cameras, if you like, in separate instances, and this file naming will just roll on from all of those cameras together. That's quite useful to us. But this is the one that really taught us how nasty image previews can be, because it doesn't like doing that image previewing across the network. So again, any of you are full nerding about this stuff and know what I'm on about and you've got some answers, I'm really interested to hear. As we shoot stuff, we kind of deal with the collection managers and curators up front and go, hey, you know, what do you want? What's significant about this? Or particularly for the Pacific and Maori material, what's appropriate in how we shoot it and how we handle it? Once we've kind of knocked that out and we've got the lighting set up, we'll send those images off for review. And once we get a gold star and a rubber stamp, that's it. We don't do any relitigating. They get one opportunity to tell us what it is that they want. Once it's agreed, the efficiency comes from like running through the whole collection without retouching it again. I'm going to give a shout out as well to our collection care team, primarily because they pulled me up on this when I did a dry run of the talk in Auckland before I came out. And they just want to say, look, we work with you really quite closely, but we're also quite proud that a bunch of people who've never worked in a museum, we have 0% issues with any damage to collections. And they are particularly proud of that. So I want to say thank you to them for being awesome and teaching us how to not be a bit, ham-fisted. But of course, we are hiring photographers who come from outside the sector, and they're not robots and they hate being robots as well. So you get that little photographer moment slip in where they actually want to be creative again before they kind of like blow their brains out in frustration, which is not actually what the project's here to do, right? Like, we're not funded to do that. But myself and my bosses and stuff like that kind of take the stance that if we turn a little bit of a blind eye and it's not taking over, then it keeps them happy, keeps them engaged with the work, and actually it's starting to give us some shots that people really, really like over and above the standard collection imaging. So it's working quite well. A little bit sort of stuff on the naming schema as well. Unique file ID, rolling file number after that. So 001 for any given collection object is the primary image. It's the first image that you'll see up on the website. And we use that rolling number scheme specifically to educate the way that they will appear up online. A lot of people talk to us about sort of quality control and checking. We actually type this stuff in. We don't use barcodes. I am kind of jealous of that Smithsonian barcode system. It's kind of cool. But they do spend years putting them on before they start, and we're just not there. So we type it in. We actually take a photograph of the label as part of one of the shots, and then later on, as we attach this stuff to the collection management system, it relies on those 2 bits of data to do a cross-check. So actually, in theory, we've got about 3 points of checking that, and at the moment, it's below 0.1% error rate. So I'm quite happy with that. And of course, the unique file name does relate uniquely to each individual collection object, and we use that as the tool to kind of stitch them together. So the processing stuff, these files come off the computers for the photographers doing their processing. We spit out 4 file formats of each image: RAW, DNG, TIFF, and JPEG. None of them are retouched. None of them, no Photoshop's ever used on any of them. There's no sharpening, there's no cropping or anything like that. What we're trying to do is save as virginal as possible images which are not altered by anything in the name of longevity and digital preservation, trying to keep these files for like 20, 50, 100 years. Those 3 archival formats are there to try and give us a belt and braces approach to understanding that as these things get filed forever, hopefully amongst those 3, one of them will be able to educate the others to provide us files into the future and stay, I guess, preserved, for want of a better way of putting it. And the JPEGs go to our collection management system. We do run 3, but here we're talking about Vernon, which is a New Zealand-based product, but I guess is fairly similar to Emu in that. And I'm going to point out the wizardry bit, because I'm going to come back to that. Some wizardry happens between the CMS and the internet. So a bit of a disclaimer now, like our IT guys are awesome. So for those of you doing imaging projects or about to, or you want to try, or you've had a failed one, this for me is one of the single biggest things which is really, really important. If you get a good IT department behind you, enabling you, as opposed to preventing you doing things, like it's so much easier, it's not funny. So I want to give a shout out to them for being awesome. But I'm also quite sort of proud to say, because Piction here being a principal sponsor, and I see other institutions in the room who are using this, it's quite nice. We're at the point where just last week we got our seed version of Piction, so the museum is in the process of implementing a DANS for the first time ever. This is causing us a lot of questions. So I'm going to draw an extra pretty green box around that last diagram. When I say that the current state is that we send files to the archive, what we really mean is some network shares with folders on it. It's not very archivy at all, right? The whole of the collection staff have access to it. They don't necessarily all have right access to it. Some of that's kind of locked down to departments and stuff. But it's not very archival in that sense. It's just stuff on servers. So what we're moving, yes, I'm going to go to this extra wizardry bit, where the JPEGs are attached to that collection management system. This is a bit where we were talking about one of the last safeguards and safety checks about the file naming. But this is actually 3 separate people conduct 3 separate scripts to get the images to attach once we've exported them into our current collection management system. So it's automated because we're scripting it, but it's still quite manual in the fact that you can't do this until that person's done this, and you have to do it like piecemeal, and it drives us all nuts. So that's where we're currently at, and where we're hoping to go with it is basically to file one file format out into Piction and then have it do everything else. We're hoping that archive, well, we know the archive because we've done all the planning. It's going to get a lot more archivey, basically. The JPEGs we fire out to the collection management system, Piction will be doing that for us. They've just been the last couple of weeks working on the integration between Vernon and Piction for that. And we're also looking, of course, at the JPEGs coming out of Piction for the internet. But notice the wizardry bit, the DCP bit, is still in this picture. This is also forcing the museum for the first time to get its head around digital preservation. Going back to page 4 of Future Museum and long-term digital guardianship, we've made a statement in our future direction that what we want to do is provide digital guardianship for our digital collections, which is quite a big statement to sort of say any of the stuff that we're making will be here just as any other collection in the museum might be. And we're at a point in the process at the moment where we're starting to realise how big a deal that is. Personally, from my background as a digital archivist and that kind of thing, I think this is awesome. But it is starting to force everybody to kind of do digitisation safely, and certainly the collection imaging project has never once clicked a photo to make anything that wasn't with all of this in mind right from the outset. But it's also starting to get the museum to face the questions about how any of the media that's being created, it might be marketing videos or something like that, or oral histories, how all of that's being created wisely for long-term preservation. And we're already in the process of doing born digital collecting. We've got a photographer's collection has just come in, which is part slides, part digital, and we've just commissioned a whole heap of, sort of VR tours through department stores in the centre of Auckland, which of course only exist in digital format. And they have been accessioned into the collection. So if you lay all of that stuff over the top of the fact we're trying to do open GLAM, and that our collections are open by default, we start to kind of paint quite a vivid picture about how much the museum's trying to take on in one go. Our rights specialist is kind of spending all day, every day, contacting rights holders, and we're actually using the letter that we approach the rights holders with is encouraging them to license everything CC BY up front. So we go backwards down there through the CC licenses, finish all rights reserved. I can't remember what the stat is about how much of it is CC BY, but the work that's happened in this first 12 months is by far and away the majority is now openly licensed. And she's going through the backlog of other stuff that we're not working on as well at the moment. We're also quite fortunate we've got 2 cultural permissions policies. So I've heard like cultural sensitivities come up a couple of times the last couple of days. All of the Maori and Pacific material is closed. That doesn't mean you can't see it. You can have all the information about it you like, and you can have a web-sized image. When it's open, you can download a full-res file and do whatever you want with it. But what it means is we have a statement which says this stuff is covered by cultural permissions, we've got a policy in place, contact us, let us know what you want to use it for, and we'll go and speak to the right people in the museum, and often out there with the EB or the community groups in the Pacific, and actually liaise with them to see what its appropriate use. The Pacific cultural process is, I believe, the first one any museum in the world has actually got a process in place and a policy to adhere to. So we're quite proud of that. So let's go into that wizardry bit. So we're doing linked open data, right? Nothing new in that. We've been talking about it for quite some time. That DCP is the digital content platform. That's our lingo for it. And it's essentially just acting as a bridge or filter between the collections and the internet. What's quite interesting is it's also the way we've got 22 different ways of describing our collections. And it's also the vehicle that we standardize that data in and present it to the web in a common format. So this does quite a lot of work. And it's all coming out through an API. The collections feed into the DCP, and it's really feeding 4 things. Collections online website, again, that's the one I pointed out at the beginning. We have an online cenotaph, which is a website which has I guess, almost like a profile page, but a unique page for every soldier that's ever served for New Zealand in conflict, like past or present. And that feeds that as well. The API feeds into that. The gallery interactives, one of which I'm going to show you in a second, also feed off this API. So when we've got digital stuff and working with the collections, it's all coming live through the APIs as well, which is quite cool. Quite nice to see the idiom tables in the sponsor hall downstairs, because we've just ordered like another 2 or 3 of them, I think. And then we do third-party users as well. So we've given this stuff to data visualization artists. We've given it, we're planning actually coming up soon, like a hackathon based off this. But we're also working with some third-party kind of organizations and formal partnerships. One of which is the Google Cultural Institute, which you'll see on the bottom there. So far, I think of the natural science museums, we're certainly the only one in New Zealand, one of only a handful in Australasia, and I think we're currently ranking behind only the Smithsonian and the British Museum in terms of the profile for the natural science collections on Google Cultural Institute. What's interesting for us is that it's 2 minutes per page view on that website versus 17 seconds on our own site. So we're getting a massively different type of reader and use for our collections. But going back up to the top, our own website's got just under 1 million things online. We're getting about 1.2 million hits a year off it from about 155,000 users. Digital New Zealand, which is a content aggregator service, which I think is about 160 partners at the moment, a little bit like Trove in Australia or Europeania is in Europe. We're seeing 40,000 hits a day and over 1 million hits a month off that. So obviously we're getting massive sort of traction compared to what we'd be getting on our own website. And what we're quite happy with is that 1% of that is a conversion into downloading and further research. And then GBIF and the ALA, I forget what these acronyms are, but basically these are the big sort of portals for kind of releasing scientific information out on. In 9 months, there's 2.2 million downloads of that stuff for research. So this is taking our material and the new images, creating in new ways and spreading it out in ways we'd never get to our own website. So this is fantastic, right? It's very evangelical and, you know, rainbows, lights, sunshine, unicorns and all that kind of jazz, right? Something must have broken at some point. Obviously, nothing ever goes smoothly. So yeah, we've had a few issues. Our lovely broncolor lights that we paid lots and lots of money for, but the first one was in the country. And when you turn them down to low volume, all the power accuracy went all over the place. So we ended up with all of the flash tubes replaced on that. Thankfully, we didn't have to pay. I'm quite glad about that. The bright orange USB cables from a company that will remain nameless that makes products that tether things are absolutely useless. They are the only 5-meter USB 3 cable that we can buy in New Zealand from any importer from any type at all. And they cost a fortune. They constantly break. It grates my gears. I have to spend this much money buying USB cables. Interestingly enough, said company who makes other products, they've also largely all broken as well. So for a company who specialises in this, not a big fan. I can also point out that the wireless app that runs these broncolor Cirrus heads that we use to control the power so nobody's running up and down ladders to things out, that works fantastic when it's not in the building. When you put these lights and the app in the building, the amount of sensors and alarms for cases and wireless points around the building, even though we've switched everything off for a big sort of radius around the place, means that this works about 20% of the time. In hindsight, and if I had the money, I would now go back and buy the flash packs with cables and old technology, you know. I'm going to touch on a logistical win here to set the scene for the logistical losses. This is the first batch of work that we did. This is a kakapo. This is a native New Zealand alpine parrot. For the one member of the audience who's been, if you went down south, you might have seen these things attacking you when you go down to the sort of the southern Alps, because they like to kind of chew the wing mirrors and kind of like wiper blades on your car. They're very, very cheeky. But these land vertebrate study skins, we didn't kill it because it was cheeky. I'm just saying it was already dead. These were great. We churned through these. All three of the photographers were in standardized images, top, bottom, a label, and then the last image of the bunch with sort of scales and color charts and their unique ID in there. These were great. We kind of rattled through these. These are really good numbers for us. What hasn't been good are those small batches of work. This is Suba, which is an ornamental, I guess like a cuff that goes between the blade and handle of Japanese swords. And we've got a collection of these. These things took long enough to set up that by the time we actually went to go and start shooting stuff, you know, all the efficiency had gone. And we're victims of our own work. We've been asked to do everything from like staff intranet photos to like rush jobs for the galleries to can you do my LinkedIn photo, all that kind of stuff. When you've got like decent photographers in the house, everybody wants to be your friend, right? But unfortunately we can't. So I spend like a number of hours each week telling people, no, sorry, you have to go and see somebody else. So wins, in that 11 months, we've tripped over 50,000 images at that standard over 15,000 collection objects. I know it's not the kind of millions that the Smithsonian guys are turning out, but it's a very, very different use case for us. What I was quite flattered about is the guys who were working at the Cooper Hewitt, when I was speaking to them, in a like-for-like scenario, we're outstripping their team. So I'm quite proud of that. And I'm also proud of images like this. This is just a small subsection of over 6,000 eggs that we've photographed. And these things vary in size from a couple of millimeters to the one that you might see looks a bit odd up there is a moa egg, which is quite large, about the size of an American football, I guess. Bearing in mind none of these are photoshopped and there's no jiggery-pokery, the 100% accuracy and repeatability across that whole collection as it comes out of the camera is allowing us to do lots of good display stuff like this. And there's no time spent photoshopping anything afterwards to make it look pretty. It's on the money straight away. We got to do a bit of science. This is structural colour. This little hummingbird, those red feathers are actually only red for about 2 degrees of viewing angle. And it's down to how the feathers are constructed at like a very small micro layer. And it's only reflective for a certain few degrees, but only a certain wavelength of light as well. So when we were having issues with this, we spoke to the curator, off he does, goes a bit of science, and comes back to us and tells us how to shoot birds like this, which meant getting a little bit creative with the lighting. And once you understand the science about how the collections you're working on works, you can come back and apply it to how you light the collections as well. That was a good day at the office playing around, trying to figure out how we can light birds with weird sort of reflective and sort of fluorescent feathers. There's been some grey areas. This is Ed Hillary's medal awarded to him. I think it's Order of the British Empire medal from memory. This is one of about 130 medals we've photographed for the gallery, which is opening. I'm going to show you in a second. The brief for this from the agency was, here's the Apple Watch photo, and there's a bag of 130 medals. Off you go. No Photoshop. This is all just lighting in the camera. This is not what we're paid to do. But for the museum to be able to then put them in a digital interactive, which is opening next week, like this, and have a big sort of touch table going through with these hero images, if we'd have contracted external photographers, we'd have had a massive bill to do this job. And we did it in-house, like subcontracting ourselves out, really, for a fraction of the cost. So a big win for the museum. It was pretty good for us because we got to get really nerdy with lighting for a little bit. And people are really, really loving the end result up on the wall. And just for reference, this is the gallery which is opening next week. So you guys, other than people in the building, will be the first people to see this. This is a heritage building restoration job and is now going to be our learning and, I guess, knowledge centre for World War I. So I'm just going to briefly run you through some of those photographers' faves, those arty ones, right? Because everybody likes some pretty pictures to finish on. These are collection of necklaces. Bearing in mind and remembering again, no Photoshop, this is as it comes out of the camera. The little shells are Powell shells. I don't know whether it's a species that exists elsewhere, but we call them Powell. Those things are actually also nightmare to light because of the sort of fluorescent finish. This is a huia. This is a native New Zealand bird, which is kind of very embedded in sort of folklore and myth and significant to New Zealand. It was hunted into extinction in about 1910, 1920, specifically for these tail feathers, which quite literally became the feather in the cap of the rich and famous who were visiting New Zealand in those early days. To have the extinct kind of icon of New Zealand's of past history come in and photograph that and see, that was a good day in the office as well, you know. It was good fun. This is the close-up of feathers of a bird called a tui, which has 2 voice boxes in it. It's very unique for the way it chirps away in the trees and everything. They're actually kind of evil. They like to dive bomb you off trees and get really aggressive, but they're very, very beautiful. And this is a 2.5 times life-sized close-up of the feathers of a hummingbird, which is probably, like 2 inches long. This image is going so well at the moment, it's actually been submitted through to our board for using for like a big sort of framed limited edition prints to give to our sponsorship and fundraising people so we can glean some cash out of them. Susan Holmes, New Zealand fashion designer in the kind of 80s, 90s, is one of her dresses that we had to shoot recently. A little bit more involved than just on white, plain photography. And you can see here Jen playing a little bit with the lights as she got it all set up. Those images are being used not just for collections use, but for blogging, exhibition design, and actually being used, I think, for exhibition content that's going off-site as well. So some recent shots that we've taken, and I guess I want to finish by asking any of you, now or later, these 3 questions. If any of you have done DAMS implementation into a museum, and you've got some big, massive wins, or don't do that, you'll just break it, come and tell me, because we're about to get like sleeves rolled up and get ourselves dirty doing that work. Anybody who's done any small batch imaging in a big production environment and how you keep that efficiency rate up I'm kind of interested to talk to anybody about that now or later, or an email or whatever. And I'm really, really, really keen to hear, whether it's from you, anybody here, or even people that you know of who aren't here, museums that are doing digital preservation. It's really common to see like libraries and archives tackling this globally now, but I can't find a single reference anywhere to a museum doing this, and we're about to try and start doing it. So I'd be really keen to sort of talk to people who are in that space. So I'm going to hand over if any of you have got any questions. We've got about 5 minutes, I think, and if not, you can run off. But that's also where to grab hold of me. Cool. Thank you. Any questions at all?
I just have a quick one about how you're, another nerdy question. Are you guys using OCR to double check the file naming? That's when you photograph that fourth shot and it's got the color card and the scale bars and the file name in it. Is there an OCR involved with that to fact check it against what your operators typed in, or how are you guys doing that?
Okay, so I'm supposed to kind of repeat the question for the audio recorder. So that's basically about using OCR to reference that image, the last image, and double check that we got all the file naming right. In short, no is the short answer to that. So subtle complications from the history of the museum about the unique file ID that we use is actually the Vernon system ID. Because historically across the collections, you would find that the accession on that little bar, the accession number on that, may actually be the same number in use in several different collections. So it's not unique. So in that regard, if you OCR'd that, you could return several results. And also historically as well, the museum's done OCR on some stuff and had hit and miss results. And I think, to be honest with you, a lot of that's because they've only ever really tried it on like manuscripts that aren't necessarily text. They could be handwritten and so on. So no, we didn't go down that. But it's a good thought.
So how are you, because it sounds like you have a couple automated QC steps in your workflow. So how are you taking that digital file, checking it against what the operators entered, and then you're exporting to the DAMs?
So to check, that last part of that quality control checking aspect is that the photographers get I guess like a dump from the collection management system on a spreadsheet. They're either, depending on preference, either copy and pasting that as they work through things, or they're actually typing it out. That same spreadsheet, along with an export that's coming out of Lightroom and like an XML file, are being reunited at the point of import. And at that point, Vernon itself is checking for what it knows it's got in the system, checking for the original spreadsheet, and then checking the output that the photographers have got. And amongst those, and the fact that it's actually all done visually up on the screen, they're kind of that like matrix of things is so far proven like enough. I think we would like to kind of put something in which is a lot more watertight, but until the data that you're working with is actually a little bit more watertight, it's kind of difficult to put something in that will only work for some stuff and not others.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm really curious to know about your org chart and who you report to. I'm a rights specialist. I work very closely with a team of full-time photographers. We can't say no. We're so buried underneath so much bureaucracy that all the things where you said what you had to say no to are all the things that take up the bulk of our day.
Okay, so for the recorder, the question is what the org chart looks like and how, as a rights specialist, you get a chance to kind of work and do your job as opposed to get sort of hammered with everything else from everybody in the organisation. Okay, so brief summary: director of the museum. Below that, there are directors, 7 or 8 areas, and that might be like marketing. We have I think there's one for IT, but ours is Director of Collections and Research. So everything collections related falls under that. The head of each department in that area, which is human history, conservation, natural science, documentary heritage, they sit on a chair group that looks after all of this collections readiness work. And we, in essence, report through that. There's like a line manager reporting difference, but really the work is held accountable to a body of people, essentially 2 rungs down. And in essence, when we get slammed with lots of people wanting help, my rights specialist, Sarah, emails me and goes, Dave, can you please get these guys off my back and give me a break? And I kind of, it doesn't take much in terms of an email, providing you send it to the right person, don't ruffle any feathers, to all of a sudden that kind of just goes quiet. But I think it's knowing the way that the system works and actually still being connected quite in a direct line to the director responsible for this work really helps. All good. No more questions. Thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate you coming along.